Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. What we are seeing here is government by chaos. The backpacker tax fiasco that has gone from problem to major problem to chaotic problem to farce. And it reached farce today when we had a joint statement that is on letterhead of the Treasurer with the new coalition, Scott Morrison and Senator Di Natale. And you pick up a few things when you've been in this place a while. And when the Treasurer attempted to table the letter, but then had a look at it, put it back on the dispatch box and didn't really want to table it, you knew that he'd botched it up. But the reason why, of course, that has happened is that it is such policy on the run, just like the legislation that is before us now. Legislation whereby we saw, as the Manager of Opposition Business indicated, silence in this chamber. The Hansard will read with a couple of blank pages because we had no copies of the bill that was before the House, no copies of the explanatory memorandum, no consultation with anyone about this deal that had been done. And what a hopeless deal it is from the government's own perspective. The backpacker tax has become the backtracker tax. Today this deal costs $155 million of backtracking by this government on its economic record, where it purports to say that it's interested in fiscal responsibility. No wonder it has increased the debt by 8 times. The deficit has increased 8 times what it was. And this was a government that said, remember, that prior to the election that they'd have surpluses every year into the future. And it just gets worse. But how have they got here will provide a study for public policy makers and academics in how not to do proper evidence-based policy. You had the grand announcement in the 2015 budget that they were going to raise over $500 million by introducing this new backpacker tax in 2015. At that stage it was the backpacker tax. That was before the backtracking that occurred on the backpacker tax. And it is the case that this is policy making that would suit Dr Seuss, frankly, in terms of the way that it has been done. Because they announced it with fanfare. They were geniuses, but they hadn't consulted the farming sector. They hadn't consulted the tourism sector. So they didn't bring in any legislation. It was still there. So what happened, of course, was that backpackers who there's this new fandangled bit of technology called smartphones and the internet, and of course young people in Europe, in Asia, in the United States, from Canada, were getting this information about this whack that was coming on in terms of taxation arrangements. So we already saw a dropping off of the number of backpackers visiting Australia. So during the election campaign, having gone through the 2016 budget, they decided that they'd defer the implementation of this tax. 18 months later, they finally introduced the legislation. 18 months of uncertainty for the agricultural and tourism sectors. They then, of course, resisted the Senate inquiry to actually consult people about processes. And when they did that, they said that it was urgent. Having waited 18 months, it all of a sudden was urgent. And of course what happened at that inquiry was that the agricultural and the tourism sectors all put forward their argument that this tax was not in the interests of those sectors and not in the interests of the economy. And we've had these absurd arguments. The first absurd argument that we've had only in the last few days is that somehow this was something to do with a decision by the former Treasurer, the member for Lilly. Well, that is just a farce, and the budget papers show that backpackers indeed were paying a rate of 0. And the 2015 announcement by Treasurer Joe Hockey said that he was introducing this new measure to raise additional money. That was the point of it, was going from 0 to 32.5. So when we hear people like the member for Riverina say, oh, we had to oppose the 32.5, it was their idea, their initiative.
Their budget.
They then decided that they would change it to 19%.
They pulled it out of thin air.
They then had no economic modelling, but they said, therefore, it would raise less additional revenue. Again, them acknowledging that this began in 2015. They, in order to make up for what they saw as a shortfall for this short-sighted policy, said that they'd change the super arrangements to 95 cents in every dollar would go straight back to the government. So that was a tax not on backpackers, that was a tax on employers that would go straight into government coffers. And that is the change that they're making here now, belatedly, to 65 cents in the dollar at a cost to the budget of $55 million over just 3 years. But they then introduced the passenger movement charge, a $5 increase, and they had the same process that they had for the backpacker tax before it became the backtracker tax. What they did was that they rang the major airlines on the day that the announcement appeared in the paper to let them know. Just in case they didn't have access to the internet at Qantas and Virgin and other major airlines. And so you had this charge of $5 being put in that was totally unrelated. So the agricultural sector were being hit, but the tourism sector were being hit twice. They were being hit with less backpackers coming here, backpackers who largely work in regional Australia, who bring more money than they earn and who spend it where they're working, in those communities. That is what they do. And now you've had, in the last 24 hours, the Prime Minister, the Treasurer and the Deputy Prime Minister actually insult people from Germany and France who come here to make a contribution. What sort of idiocy does that? We don't want rich backpackers coming here from Germany and France. Completely absurd. People who come here, make a contribution, spend more money than they earn here, and what's more, the next time they come back with their families in a few years' time, they stay not at the hostel, they stay at the Hilton, and they spend even more money. And the whole time when they go back to Germany and France and to the region, they're showing people the photos of their experience in Cairns, in Broome, in Mount Isa, in Gladstone, in Indi, in that electorate. And what they do is they become advocates for Australian tourism, and they create jobs. But then you had, because they lost a vote in the Senate on the passenger movement charge on the Wednesday night, on the Thursday as the bells were ringing, they went into the chamber and handed the One Nation senators a draft amendment that they'd had done up, a 5-year freeze that we know from a ruling from the Speaker of the House of Representatives just this week is not worth anything at all. We're a sovereign parliament, and we're talking about a tax increase that in July the government promised not to do. They promised a freeze for this term, as we did, because we know that it's a counterproductive tax, that at the end of the day, if you discourage people from coming to Australia, if you discourage that economic activity, you end up in a worse fiscal position. It's counterproductive. So you have that. But it's worse. It isn't just that they promised it at the election. After this election, unlike after the 2013 election where they forgot to appoint a tourism minister, at least they did appoint one. And he stood at the dispatch box and said that increases to the passenger movement charge would choke the golden goose that is the tourism industry. That is what he said 2 weeks before the government announced this tax increase. 2 weeks before. And then he wasn't even consulted about the decision that was made. He was on his way to the Middle East when the Cabinet made this decision. The 5-year freeze is a farce, and the senators across the other place were conned on that issue. So then you had the announcement of a so-called deal. It was all done days ago, of a 15% backpacker tax. So the backtracker tax had gone from 32.5 to 19 and then down to 15. This time they were really serious. There were no more negotiations. Victory was done. Mission accomplished, said the Treasurer. And yet, we have today a complete failure of leadership. So obsessed are those opposite with not being cooperative with the other major political party, the Australian Labor Party, that they have preferred to enter into an arrangement when we had said we'll cop 13% because it does align with the withholding tax in horticulture that is paid to Australian backpackers who it's unclear whether they'll meet the income tax-free threshold. And yet they prefer this arrangement that costs $155 million to the budget, $100 million more than they would have had to have spent otherwise, in an arrangement with the Australian Greens and the One Nation Party. Well, this is the mob, I guess, who helped recreate the One Nation Party with their genius strategy of the Double D election earlier this year. But now, instead of having an arrangement that would have minimised the differential impact on the budget, they now have a $155 million hit to the budget, and a Treasurer reduced to a humiliation of having Richard Di Natale, the leader of the Australian Greens, on a joint release on the Treasurer letterhead. Completely absurd. But what we've seen with this the whole way through is a whole lot of misinformation. You've had the absurdity saying that Australian workers would be taxed at a higher rate than foreign workers. This is a mob that don't seem to understand that it was Labor that tripled the income tax-free threshold to $18,200, thereby taking 1 million Australians out of the tax system. If Australian workers earn the same as your average backpacker, guess how much tax they'll pay? Zero, not $1. And yet those opposite have continued to engage in this misinformation. This has been absolutely chaotic from the government. They've had at least 5 positions in the last month after having one position of 18 months that has caused distress and concern in the agriculture and tourism sector, and this government should stand condemned for this chaos.
I thank the honourable